morning and welcome back to the lecture series on fiction, epics, novels and poetry. We are discussing genealogy, which is a study of genres. Even before we start discussing the individual genres, we start understanding what the novel is, what the short story is, or even a genre that preceded novel and short story, such as the epic. Before we start unpacking these vast literary forms, genres, we need to understand what is the study of genre, which is called genealogy. So, we have to understand that genre has been looked at, has been studied in a certain way from a certain perspective in the neoclassical period. So, we have to understand genre and neoclassical and classical formulation. It would not be wrong to say that there are mainly three modes, or in other words, how do we understand mode? When we say mode, it refers to ways of expressing. So, three modes of literary art, three major modes of expressing literary art: narrative mode, comprising novel, short stories. Then we have the dramatic mode comprising tragedy, comedy, and then the lyric mode comprising sonnet, elegy, ode, among others. So, in classical antiquity period, we see that the entire way of looking at literature in the classical antiquity period, which was largely informed by authoritarianism and rationalism, segregation of genres becomes a fixity. So, different orators, speakers and intellectuals such as Cicero stressed this segregation of literary genres. Cicero in De Optico Genre Oratorum on the best kind of orators says that genres should be strictly compartmentalized. Horace similarly demanded that each genre should keep to its designated place and not leak into another. So, we see that Cicero, Quintilian, Horace, all of these prominent state figures, orators, poets advised that the genres should be kept separate from one another. So, in emulation of the classical order, it is symptomatic of the neoclassical frame of mind to want to preserve the established order through generic purity. So, once again the trends of and the perspectives of classical period, antiquity period come back in neoclassicism, and neoclassical formulation also talks about achieving some kind of generic purity. Yet in neoclassical English literature itself, we see mixed kinds also positively thrived side by side. So, in neoclassical English literature, we however see that mixed kinds also positively thrived. One example would be Fielding-esque novel, or even the satiric epic. All these are mixed genres, and they flourished very well during the neoclassical period. So, neoclassical theorists stated that the action of a kind may have a characteristic structure. So, for example, entanglement refers to multiplicity of episodes that are typical of the romance. In this, romance contrasts with the epic. So, this typical quality of entanglement enables romance to be distinguished from the epic. So, Chaplin announces that, to quote him, unity of action among the general rules that every epic poem must observe is especially the principal one without which the poem is not an epic poem but a romance. unquote. So, this boundary line between epic and romance is not very distinct. So, the qualities that make a romance uh, need to be uh, adhered with. Otherwise, what I am trying to say is that romance could very well and very easily smooth into the appearance of the epic. So, otherwise romance could very easily slip into the appearance of the epic. Romances consequently therefore lack perfection, uh, since to quote Chaplin again, I quote, they pile adventure upon adventure and include fights, love affairs, disasters, and other things, of which one well treated would make a laudable effect, whereas together they destroy each other. Unquote. So, every kind has its range of appropriate style, and beyond that range it goes on to lose its purity, its pure characteristics, and verge into another and verge into the domain of another genre. So, in fact, some generic kinds have their existence identified through rhetorical organization. To an extent, their rhetorical selection, so to an extent, their rhetorical selections follow from the subject matter that is prescribed by the genre to which they belong. So, besides the traditional genre linked constituents, there are other elements more recently distinguished, such as the reader's task. So, Frank Kermode would develop the idea of a hermeneutic task in the reading of a detective story, for example. Such a form demands elucidation of a given problem, often posed at the outset of the narrative, and this involves what Kermode would call interplay between narrative and hermeneutic processes. So, while some kinds entice the reader into labyrinths of moral analysis, other kinds require exquisite discriminations between events which actually occurred in the author's fiction and those that are merely fictions of a narrator. So, there is this difference between fictions that happen, that take place, events that take place within the frame of the narrative while the narrative is going on, and then some actions that are referred to by the narrator that have already taken place even before the narrative has started. So, different kinds may be recognized in terms of particular characteristics, such as exodium, closure, inset referring to digression or play within a play, then symmetry and other structural forms. In the same way, there are representational manners. The representation could be realistic or surrealistic, which distinguish one kind from the other. So, these are some of the determinants based on which different kinds are formed within a genre. So, according to some critics, modes can be an elusive generic idea. Modal terms tend to be adjectival, such as the expression, such as the expression like comedy, comic play, and the comic. Now, comic play is nearly equivalent to comedy. However, we see that comic is applied to kinds that are other than comedy. So, for example, when Jane Austen's Emma is called a comic novel, it is not a comedy or comic in the traditional sense of the term. When a modal term is linked with the name of a kind, it refers to a combined genre where the overall form is determined by the kind alone. So, in that case, there is seldom room except by a special tour de force for two external forms in a single work. So, when we talk of heroic epic form in Paradise Lost, Milton's Paradise Lost, or the rape of the lock, the adjectival term is coupled with external form. However, in such cases, the adjective is merely a grammatical transformation of the noun, and therefore it refers to the kind and not to the mode. On the other hand, the expression pastoral, for example, implies the existence of a pastoral kind only in the sense of grammar, only grammatically. Critically, when we talk of pastoral, we are talking, we are referring to, critically, when we talk of pastoral, we are referring to a pastoral elegy, a pastoral eclogue. So, modal extension can be either local or comprehensive. Locally, modes may amount to no more than fugitive admixture with some genres, with some generic color. So, locally, modes may amount to no more than figurative admixtures with some generic color. They are hardly more than the vague intimations of different moods. Now, some non-literary or no longer literary kinds are recognized as having generated literary modes. Some of the examples would be topographical, mythological, apocalyptic. Remarkably, in this case, several important literary kinds such as essay and novel are not supposed to correspond to modes. So, there are two converse peculiar tendencies that we see in genealogy. So, an emblematic mode commonly has quite extensive generic repertoire. One mode that has shown remarkable persistence is the metaphoric, an extension from Ovid's Metamorphoses, and it is frequently in the Elizabethan Epyllion, and it also appears locally in the Fairy Queen, the first conclusion of Book 3 of Fairy Queen, and also in Polyolbion. So, Keats, Shelley, all these poets use the metaphoric mode. More recently, the extensions of metaphoric mode are observable in science fiction, and we see this attempt in Ursula Le Guin's Lathe of Heaven. So, similarly, the Gothic romance, the kind that we see in the Old English Baron, yielded a Gothic mode which outlasted it. So, similarly, the Gothic romance, such as the Old English Baron, which yielded a Gothic mode, outlasted the form of Gothic romance itself, and it was applied to kinds as diverse as the maritime adventure that we see in the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, the psychological novels such as Titus Crone, and the crime novels such as Edwin Drood. Now, satire is the most problematic mode to the taxonomists, since it appears never to have corresponded with any one kind. Satire can parody a travel book like we see in Gulliver's Travels. It could parody epic as in The Rape of the Lock, in a diary writing, so a diary of the Great War by S. Pepys Jr., in the form of index writing like we find in William King, and also in the form of lexicon or dictionary as we find in Ambrose Bierce. So, contrasting satiric with non-satiric parodies such as Elizabethan spiritual parodies of popular songs, purely formal parodies or postmodernist deconstructions points out that satire means more than parodic imitation. So, we cannot say that satire and parody are exactly one and the same thing. Taxonomic complexity of satire implies its possibility of modal combination with other genres in a way that does not empty only in and by parody. So, thus Joseph Heller's Catch-22 is a satiric work, but it is also a novel, and some of Edwin Morgan's Instamatics combine satire with imagist lyric too. So, most historical kinds may be divided, at least in principle, into subtypes. So, odes are anacreontic or major, epithalamic or nuptial, or genethliac, referring to birthday, according to the subject and occasion that it centers on, that it focuses on. Such groups have a relatively simple logical relation. Now, the category of subgenre helps to resolve the old problem of whether a genre is governed by subject or by form. So, division of kinds into subgenres normally goes by subject matter or in terms of motives. If subgenres are created through distinguishing additional genre linked motifs and topics, then one can carry the division and subdivision of kinds even further along more and more minute specifications, right. So, and this division and subdivisions along a specific determinant, like I said, can go on. We can further divide and subdivide a genre, a subgenre, and so on, so forth. So, subgenres also, so if subgenres are created through distinguishing additional genre linked motifs and topics, it follows that one can carry the division and subdivision of kinds even further along more and more minute specifications. So, a subgenre could be further broken down and made into smaller categories or classifications and so forth. So, subgenres also threaten to defy subdivisions in that they are extremely volatile. To determine the features of a subgenre is to trace a diachronic process of imitation, variation, innovation, all of which verge onto source study. Modern subgenres are so numerous that being mostly unlabeled, they remain largely unrecognized and hard to describe. A few can be designated briefly, however. For example, the confessional poem, the satirical Last Will and Testament, which originates from Villon and is repopularized by Adrian Henry, the epigram on a historical personage. We have, for example, Robert Lowell's History, the message from a symbolic country such as the ones written, such as this reminds us of works by W.H. Auden and Matthew Dunn, and the sinister catechism as one finds in the writings of Walter de la Mare, T.F. Muir, Auden and Charles Kingsley. So, just like lyric has assimilated other short poetic kinds, making them all subgenres of lyric itself, in the same way the novel has assimilated other kinds of prose fictions. A comprehensive genre can have a weak unitary force in practical use. That is how it is. The novel has largely ceased to function as a kind in the ordinary sense. Its minimal specification has even been stated as an extended piece of prose fiction, a specific case in which external form appears, but only as extended and as prose. So, discussing types of novel draws greatly on Northrop Frye's greatly on Northrop Frye's four strands or formal ingredients of prose, which are romance, confession, novel in the strong sense of the term, and anatomy. So, the last, anatomy, is a formal type which embraces the forms of Menippean or narrative satire, as well as of systematic non-fictional works such as the Anatomy of Melancholy and Anatomy of Criticism. The novel has ramifying roots in earlier fictions as well as non-fictions, so we can see traces of the qualities of a classical novel in epic, romance, picaresque, uh, biography, history, journal, letter, exemplary tale, uh, or fables, novella, among others. So, the most influential division of the novel has been a dichotomy or bipolar analysis into Roman and Recit. So, since Ramon Fernandez's messages, this division has commonly been regarded as fundamental. Um, it is a starting point of a great deal of criticism, particularly of the French novel. So, Samuel Richardson's epistolary novels do not recount life at the same time when it takes place, and this is the characteristic of Roman. Uh, so, the epistolary novels by Richardson recall or recount experiences through documents that are subsequently written after the events have happened, in which the events have already taken place, like I said. So, on the other hand, the authorial intrusions and interpolated essays in the novels of Henry Fielding never allow the reader to forget the telling of the tale, the instantaneity of the tale. So, setting the novel is so decisive, even when not directly realized through description, that it often provides the basis of typology or typology. So, we have the factory novel, the school novel, the rustic novel, the city novel, the university novel, the provincial novel, and now it is called the regional novel, the Indian novel, and so forth. So, the adventure novel, abolition novel, war novel, crime novel, espionage novel, political novel, novel of faith and doubt, Freund Roman, familiar Roman, or domestic novel, nature novel, Bildungsroman, uh, uh, all of these types have some degree of generic coherence too, although they diverge, they also have some commonality to them. So, phenomenon, or as Steve Kellman would call, the self-begetting novel is the novel about writing. So, the work in progress is being commented on through the self-begetting novel. So, poiemen, or as Stephen Kellman calls it, the self-begetting novel is the novel that comments on the work in progress or about the act of writing itself. It is a less recognized subgenre. Similarly, writing becomes a special factor in the very similar novel, in which writers have always been common points of reference in their own writing. Other quasi generic groupings include mythic types. Here we are thinking of quest or divine retribution, types involving dependence on an antecedent. It could be parody or pastiche, purely formal constructive types, catalogue or anatomy, and the collective productions of schools or movements. So we are thinking of the metaphysical school, the romantic movement, the Georgian school, and so forth. So groupings are also made in terms of types of treatment of an original or a paradigm. This could refer to a classic or a famous work, as in pastiche, as in cento, or imitation, or a work to be rejected or ridiculed, as in the case of parody, burlesque, or the answer poem. Finally, there is the category of ever and collective ever. For example, the metaphysical poets wrote in many different kinds, and yet their poems generally bear a closer resemblance to one another than between, let's say, the love elegies or different schools, or even between poems written by the same writer. I would like to stop our discussion here, and I'll meet you with another round of discussions and in another lecture. Thank you.